Welcome, everyone, to the Rad Friends podcast. I'm so excited. We're still in the pilot, and I've got my friend Suzi Sosa here. Hi, Suzi.
Hello. It's great to be here.
So as we were talking before, the premise of this podcast is to just get conversations going. Again, not this kind of very scripted, prepared podcast, but more just like people talking. We've got a question that we will be
Mm.
addressing later, and the question is, why are we so obsessed with growth? But before we kick in, let's just say, okay, so Susie, we were talking a little bit about CrossFit. So you walk into the CrossFit gym and there's a new face, and the person says, "Hey, Susie, like how do you spend your days? How do you spend your time? How do you answer?"
Oh, well, definitely a big part of my life is being a social entrepreneur. So I founded and ran my own company, which was an online learning company, but I'd get involved in all kinds of social enterprise startup projects, for profit, nonprofit. I'm actually the chair of the board of a nonprofit that is making free personal development and educational materials for people in prison. And we're working on an earned income business model for that. So that's a big part of my life. I'm also a mom of two kids who are 11 and 14, and I do spend a fair amount of time working out.
Yes. All right. I had no idea about. Tell me more about the nonprofit.
Yeah, it's amazing. So they're headquartered here in Austin, but they're nationwide, and they're really filling in the gap of having scalable, free, but printed educational resources for people in prison. So we produce little topical booklets on things from, meditation to entrepreneurship to preparing for a food service certification. We're actually about to publish one on the basics of computer programming, but it's all printed on 8.5 by 11 paper. And the founder has developed this incredible software to manage the distribution and collection logistics of these booklets. So he has basically the first nationwide database of all the prisons in the US. It doesn't exist
Wow.
anywhere else. And
Wow.
he's figured out how to affordably send these materials. And then the people in prison complete little quizzes when they've finished the book and they send it back. And Alex can correspond with them. They share more about what they want to learn about. He sends them a certificate, which a lot of people use as part of their presentation to a parole board. So he's having incredible impact at a cost of like 40 cents per person. So it's pretty exciting.
Wow.
Yeah.
And is it the reason it's physical books, or what's the reason that you emphasize the physical pamphlet
Because
part of
there
it?
are no devices
Mm.
available to a lot of these individuals. And especially if you think about people who are on solitary confinement, but they just don't have access. And there have been some, prison based education programs. Those that require tablets become very restricted because, they can only allow a few people at a time to utilize them, or it might be restricted based on your status in prison. So this just really democratizes access to the information.
How
Yeah.
did you, is prison supporting prisoners, prisoner, I don't know the right language, but how did you get involved in that cause? Has it called you or?
Well, it's interesting because Alex, the founder, he's based here in Austin, and we connected even before he started. Level is the name of the nonprofit, and so he wanted my help just getting it started, incorporated, get the very first funding, and so I did that before I really knew much about people in prison. But one of the ways you can volunteer to support Level is actually by transcribing the completed booklets into Level's database, which is how they track their outcomes. And so my kids and I have actually volunteered several hours transcribing these booklets, and the people share a lot about themselves and their lives and their aspirations and what Level means for them. And it transformed my sense of who people in prison are. I completely had a stereotype. And
Wow.
so that has shifted my relationship to the work. Like I feel much more connected to it now than I did when I first got involved. Yeah.
So you said you have an 11-year-old and a
Mhm.
14-year-old?
Yeah.
And so they take is it like a family, like you get around the table and throw some music
Yeah.
on and
Well,
transcribe them?
What's cool is you could do it from anywhere. So Alex has a process where he scans in all the booklets. So they're all in PDFs for volunteers to access from anywhere in the world. And then you transcribe it into his database. So yeah, we've done it all in sort of in different times as well, because my daughter had some volunteer hours for school that she needed to complete. So yeah, we've all been involved.
That's so okay. So this is a question that I think about often I think, well, myself having raising kids in these kind of like
Mhm.
very bubble like neighborhoods. So
Yep.
we're from Brooklyn. They were born in Brooklyn, like Dumbo, Brooklyn, where there's the Soho House and all that. And now we live in Manhattan Beach. So some of the most, highest priced real estate
Yeah.
in America. But it's a bubble. And the schools are bubbles, even though they're public schools. And I really, and I did not grow up that way. I grew up in a lower middle class, then kind of
Mhm.
eventually upper middle class. But I'm struggling, or it's always on my mind. Like, how do I show my kids that this beautiful bubble that we live in is
Mhm.
incredible from like a
Mhm.
child raising perspective, but it is
Mhm.
so disconnected from reality,
Yeah.
how everyone else lives. And so I'm
Mhm.
curious, like as a social, I mean, you do this with them, but on top of that, you're a social entrepreneur. How do you, I don't know what Austin
Yeah.
is like bubble wise,
Yeah.
but how do you think of that as a mom, and as a parent?
Yeah. I think about it a lot. I honestly don't know if it's something that you can really solve, because even when you take your kids into like a service opportunity, you're coming in this position of privilege, like to help, right? So, it's different. It's like sometimes more like sympathy than empathy. So, what I've really focused on is having my kids start to think about their responsibility from their position of privilege.
Oh, wow.
So, it's very likely that my kids are going to, there'll be quite a lot of money that gets passed down to them, whether it's individually or in some kind of family foundation. And so I'm already having the conversation about like, what are you going to impact in the world?
Mm,
What are you going to stand for? What do you care about? Where are you going to make a difference? So, I think struggle is what makes empathy. And there's a really beautiful book that made a difference in my life. It's called When Things Fall Apart, When Things
Oh,
Fall
yeah.
Apart by a Buddhist monk named Pema Chodron.
Yeah.
I'm probably saying it wrong. But one of the key messages in that book is that, when our lives fall apart around us, what it really activates is like our compassion and our vulnerability, and that sensitive part inside of us that connects us to other humans. And so I think about my kids, like the way they're only really going to be able to develop deep empathy is through some experience of suffering and struggle. And of course, as a parent, how do you create that in a way that
Mhm.
you can tolerate?
Yeah.
So I don't think of like volunteering makes things more human, and certainly, transcribing letters from people in prison really humanizes them, and that's
Mhm.
profound. But that's different than, I also want them to have that empathy of a
Yeah.
shared experience with people that come from different backgrounds.
And what is that? How does that? Because I've been taking my kids to volunteer, like, oh, I'm showing them this and that. But how does, I mean, we freak out when our daughter, doesn't, crosses the street like a little too, that our kids are younger, they're 9 and 6.
Mm.
But how do you envision that kind of a shared struggle? I forget the words you use. Like, what do you think
Yeah.
that looks like? It's not like
Well,
Habitat for Humanity, right? It's not that kind of
no. I
stuff.
mean, when I was growing up, I traveled. Like, I can't imagine it now, but when I was a freshman in high school, my mom sent me on a study abroad to Moscow,
Wow.
1991. No cell phones. Like, I was 13
Wow.
years old. I hadn't turned 14 yet. And I'm going to Moscow by myself, with a program, but like, that was scary. you know?
Wow. Just like get on
And
a plane with, or did
mhm.
someone fly you there?
No, I went by myself. Like my parents, yeah, yeah, exactly. At 13. And
Wow.
then I went again in college between my freshman and sophomore year. I went and worked in a summer camp in Siberia. I also did not have a cell phone. So I remember I had to go into town to like a payphone to call my mother. But
Wow.
those were experiences where I was scared, I was alone, like I had to figure things out for myself. I saw things like I was there. I wasn't just like a tourist,
Mhm.
looking out the window at people. I was there. So travel was a really big way for me. And then it's just life, like
Yeah.
I don't know how much you and I have shared of this story, but I went from being a very wealthy multimillionaire to getting divorced and being broke. And I got humbled. So
Wow.
I think that whole journey of like, from wealth to struggling single mom with,
Mhm.
a couple $100,000 of debt. That was when I
Um,
was reading that Pema Chodron book about when
yeah.
things fall apart and my own capacity for empathy and for the struggles of other single moms and, people that don't have the resources and even just the cultural privilege that I have, like, it blew
Yeah.
open in that moment in a way that going to volunteer at like a shelter for battered women,
Yeah.
it's not going to do the same thing, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And do you, what, if you don't mind me ask, when your mom said, what did your mom, like, what was her plan? Did you have family in Moscow, or was this like, I'm going to
No,
teach my daughter how to see the world at
I
13?
don't. My mom, I'm the oldest of 5 kids, and my mom was an entrepreneur with a restaurant. And so I think, I don't even know that it was thought, it was just like,
Just,
go. So,
wow.
yeah. So, but she also, she came from a different culture too. My parents are from England. I was born there and they grew up traveling more to Europe and taking
Mhm.
trains. And I think there was a little bit more of that. But yeah, my parents, they didn't have the luxury of worrying every minute about what we were doing and if we crossed the street before the
I
rest of the
know,
family.
I know. And you see, like, do you see yourself being able to do that as a parent? Maybe not 13. I mean, your kids are 11, and so they're at that age. You're probably not sending them to
Yeah.
Moscow tomorrow.
Well, so I think one of the questions that you asked me that we might talk about was like, "What's something on your mind lately?" And I was like, "Oh,
Mhm.
what have I been thinking about the past couple days?" Well, a question came up last night that kind of
Okay.
relates to this conversation. My daughter went yesterday to the mall with some friends, and
Is she the
they
eldest or the
yeah, she's
youngest?
4 she's 14, just finished 8th grade, going into high school in the fall. And they went to the mall, and she came home and told me that one of her friends was trying to buy a vibrator from
Oh,
the
wow.
gift shop in the mall. And so I asked her, like, "Well, what is an appropriate age for a girl to get a vibrator?" Right?
Mhm.
And I feel like these are related in the sense of like,
Yeah.
oh my God, my kid is out there, like she's a
Mhm.
sexual being, like, and
Mhm.
that's the same as being out in the world and crossing a
Yeah.
busy street, and
Yeah.
for me, 14 feels so young. And I'm like, you're just
Mhm.
still this naive little
I
baby. But then I'm
know.
like, but she's going to drive in 2 years. She's going to
Yeah.
graduate in 4 years. So
Wow.
it's these moments of reckoning of like, oh, your child is like actually probably ready for that milestone that I'm not
Mm.
ready for.
Yes, I
So,
know. And I feel like isn't that parent, especially it probably accelerates where they're gonna always be pushing it, one step. You're always gonna feel behind, right?
yes, yes, yes,
Oh my God.
exactly.
Thinking of my 9 and my 6-year-old. I'm like, no,
You can't, I could,
I'm
my
not
14 year
ready.
old, I'm like, wait, what? You just bought bras like 2 years ago. Now we're into
Yeah.
vibrators? Like, oh my
Wow.
God. Yeah.
Did I'm impressed that she wanted to even share that with you.
Well, I really have endeavored to create a very open culture around talking about sex.
Mhm.
That's something that in the realm of our generation of parenting, right?
Yeah.
Porn and, kind of like targeting over social media of like photographs and sex and all this stuff. I've always had the philosophy that I can't shelter my kids from
Yeah.
it, that I have to teach them to be like savvy consumers or like savvy stewards,
Yeah.
citizens in this sexualized social media world. So yeah, so I have tried to have it be a space where they can share things like that. But it's still sometimes I have to go have my own private like conversation with Steve and be like,
Yeah.
is that okay?
Oh my God. I know I mean you're 5 years ahead, at least eldest girl wise. So I know who I'm gonna be calling. Yeah, it is. I admire, I have that desire for openness and like with my kids, like I really try to I heard when Michelle Obama say this once where I always talk to my kids as their adults. It doesn't mean that I tell them everything, but I don't, it's not storks and all
Yeah.
all that bullshit, but at the same time I feel the uncomfortable pushing of the boundaries, like it's like starting to round the corners. So, oh man.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, because also when you think about when you learned about some of this stuff, I was like, wait, I wasn't like an adult when I learned
Mhm.
what that
Oh,
was. How do you know what that is? And do you
my
know what
parents
that
still
is?
my parents still don't say I love you to me. So it's like we weren't talking about
Yeah.
any of that stuff.
Yeah. There was one funny moment at the dinner table, the term kink came up.
Okay.
And my 14-year-old was like, oh yeah, like I know all about kink. I said, oh, you do? I said, well, what does kink mean? And she said, well, you know it when you see it. And I was like, oh,
Mm.
she doesn't really know.
Oh
You
man.
know?
I feel like that I would struggle to answer that. That's actually a good answer. It's like modern art. It's like hard to define, but you know it when you see it.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Oh man.
Yeah.
That that's great. So I want to thank you for sharing that. Now that image is just stuck in my head of what to expect at dinner in 5 years. You know what's crazy? It wasn't even that long ago, but people I used to work with when their daughters, it was always men with daughters, when their daughters started having cell phones, they like basically installed tracking software on their phone. And I get the intent. I get the fear,
Yeah.
but it's like the foundation that is built on is a slippery slope
Yeah.
towards a lot of bad shit happening.
Yeah. Well, or what I thought you were going to say, like the foundation is fragile
Yeah.
because at some point it's going to break.
Yeah.
You cannot wall them off. You cannot track them. What you
Hmm.
have to do is build the skills so that when they are alone, they can make good decisions, right?
Yeah.
And those skills require like more difficult conversations
Yeah.
about all kinds of things. My daughter went to New York City on a school field trip this spring, and I just said like, hey, she has a cute little backpack that she was going to wear and put her money and her cell phone and everything. And I was
Hmm.
like, hey, when you're in New York, especially if you're on the subway, you need to turn that backpack and put it on the front of your body so you can cover it and not be
Hmm.
standing on the subway with all your money and your phone in the back. And she
Yeah.
was like,
Yeah.
what? And so then when she came back, I said, how was New York? What do you think? She said, I just kept thinking about getting mugged the whole time.
Oh, I know. I
I was
know.
like, that's that's the beginning of relating to the world, right? And I wish
Yeah.
she could have relaxed more and maybe had fun with her friends and wouldn't that have been cool? But that's the kind of coaching that I don't know. I feel like I have to give her is like, you got to be aware.
Yeah.
You're not in your bubble anymore. You're not in
Yeah.
Austin with your mom 10 steps behind and,
Hmm.
not a human being within a 10-foot radius. So
Yeah.
those are the hard conversations that you
Oh
had to, like,
man.
you got to shatter the bubble.
Can I there's one question that I want to always ask people who have older kids. I know a lot of our listeners, they're going to range, but they're probably
Mhm.
most of the people listening to this either are like married without kids to like kids probably around your age, but like not empty nesters, but like up until empty nesters. So
Yeah.
it's kind of like we're right in that sweet, like between our kids' age, we're kind of covering like a large ground. But the thing that I've heard from because many parents who have teenage kids and phones is what has become more common is the parent gets a call. No, the kid. So your child would go to you like in the middle of the night and say, "Hey, I just saw on social media that this person wants to kill themselves." And I've heard this happen to like three different, like unrelated groups of kids. And I'm like, the thought of the thought of being woken up in the middle of the night by your kid is scary enough. And it's a weird thing because sometimes the parent doesn't know the kid's parent. So it's like,
Yeah.
and then sometimes the kid is telling the parent, like, because they're scared, like, because they don't know what to do, but they don't want to like out the
Yep.
kid and all that. So
Yep.
it's a very random question, but I was wondering if anything like that
Well,
had ever happened.
yes. So I've been on a couple of the sides. So my son's elementary school best friend was cutting herself
Mm.
and was suicidal. And I got a frantic call one day from her father who shared that she had tried to kill herself that night. She was in the hospital, and that as part of the protocol, they had taken her phone and were reading some of her text messages, and that my son had sent pictures that he had been kind of cutting himself in solidarity with her.
Oh,
And
wow.
so, yeah, welcome to the world of these conversations. So, here I am racing to school to pick him up. And he's like, what's going on, mom? And yeah,
Oh.
it was heartbreaking. He was just sobbing because really his grief was over his friend. That he's like,
Yeah.
it hurts me so much that she's so sad, mom. Doesn't she know that people loved her?
Yeah.
And my daughter, who's 14, she and some friends went to their school guidance counselor because one of the girls in their group said she was going to kill herself, and it had gone on for a while. So I do
Mhm.
think this is more, present.
And yeah,
Mhm.
wow. And I guess because I think back to, I mean, it's kind of stupid to, or it's kind of moot to think back to like when I was, but obviously there weren't cell phones, but I mean, I'm sure there were kids that were suicidal.
Mhm.
It wasn't.
More clothes, maybe.
Yeah, I guess like if someone knew, it wasn't like it didn't spread like wildfire on social media. It was,
Yeah.
maybe like a small group of people. Like I didn't know, but I was also very naive in high school.
I
So
do also think that mental health today is worse
yeah.
than it was. And I think that's a conversation that isn't being had enough about the state of mental health in the world. Right now, I think it is very poor. And so, yeah, there's a lot of things happening in our culture and society that are augmenting it, social media being one of them.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't know the statistics, but my hypothesis would be that the suicide rate is higher
Mm-hmm.
now than I think in that movie. What was the social media movie?
I know which one you're talking about, but I don't
The
remember the
social
name.
dilemma. The
Yeah.
social dilemma. They had a graph of like teenage girls
Yeah.
suicides, or at least suicidal thoughts, and like how that
Mm-hmm.
had been, skyrocketing in correlation with social media. So,
The one that Jonathan Haidt,
Mhm.
who's written a bunch of great books. One is I think that he has one called the Uncoddling of the American Mind, or something
Mhm.
like that. But he talks about the divergent suicide rates for teenage boys and teenage girls.
Mhm.
And I'll never forget, I heard this years ago, but I'll never forget it. What he said is he said that a big part of adult adolescence is identity. And with that comes like violence. And he
Mhm.
said with boys, a lot of the violence is actually in video games.
Mhm.
And a lot of these video games
Mhm.
now, I'm not a gamer, but they're
Mhm.
much more collaborative. So
Mhm.
there's actually, even amidst the violence,
Mhm.
it's camaraderie, and it's video games.
Mhm.
And obviously video games get a mixed rap. But with girls, it's social violence.
Mhm.
And so it's
Mhm.
just sabotaging relationships. So it's the
Mhm.
whole like, you got invited to a party, you didn't, you talking shit, and then with the prevalence of social, the capability to do
Yeah.
social violence is like
Yeah.
exponential, and it's hitting
Yeah.
girls harder.
Yeah. Welcome to my world. I'm not kidding. Like in the last couple of years of middle school, my daughter's been in like one friend circle and then another
Oh,
and best
yeah.
friends. And now I hate her and I da 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 and it just goes on and on. And it's like dizzying.
Yeah. Oh,
It's
man.
crazy. And, she's been a perpetrator of, what you're referring to as social violence. Like I know things have been said and things have been done. The big thing right now in middle school with middle school kids is they get in these chat groups.
Okay.
And then the thing is you kick someone out of the
Oh,
chat
wow.
group, right? That's how they get socially ostracized. And so
Wow.
she got kicked out of this important chat group and, I was sort of wow, they said I did this, but I really meant that. And I was
Mm.
ooh, like, I could just feel the games
Oh my
being played in
gosh.
there. And yeah, it's pretty fascinating. It really has me wondering, like, how is school mentally toxic? Like because it's such an artificial construct to be
Mm.
forced with this group of people day in and day out. Sometimes, like when I was growing up for, 10 years, I was with the
Wow.
same group of people. And there's like these little cliques and beefs and who likes who and who hates who and your exes and the crushes. And it's
Yeah.
so weird. And I was like, in my adult life, if I had a breakdown like she had with
Mm.
people in my life, we probably just wouldn't be friends anymore. We
Yeah,
wouldn't see each
yeah.
other. They're in this like pressure cooker. And it does feel like it has a lot of adverse mental health consequences, to be
Yeah.
stuck with the same group of people for 7, 10 years.
Yeah, yeah. But the isn't one argument that that's to be able like that's kind of a training of sorts, like school as a socialization, because it's always the argument against homeschooling, right? Well,
Yeah.
what about this? And I don't know if that's a valid argument or not. It's just the one that, it's
Like
funny. Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. Those are two sides of a spectrum, right? You don't
Yeah.
interact with anybody, or you're stuck with the same
Yeah.
class from elementary school through
To
high
12th
school in the
grade.
worst
Yeah.
case, right? Like my
Mhm.
daughter's going to go to a different high school next year. She's going to an arts academy, and I'm really glad. There's only
Mhm.
3 people from her middle school who are going with her, so she's going to get to kind of like roll again.
Yeah.
Which, you think about it, that's what adults do. You like move to a
Mhm.
new city or you
Yeah.
go work in a different company or you go to college and you get to kind of like refresh your friend group and recreate
Mhm.
yourself.
Yeah.
But observing middle school, well, we'll talk about it in 3 years when you're on the other side. You can tell me.
Oh
It
my
feels like
god.
it's really messed up.
Oh man. Yeah, we're actually thinking of going abroad for middle school. And so just
Mm.
being like hard reset and then new environment, like the newness, not middle school is middle school everywhere is the famous saying. But maybe that's like that's a path, but I'm like still counting like it's only 2 years. So I'm counting the days. So okay, so let's switch. Before we get to our question, you and I have been texting. So, Mark Zuckerberg, this is a complete 180. It's a little bit, it's 2 weeks old now, but Mark Zuckerberg did this famous CrossFit workout called called Murph. And so
Yeah.
do you want to describe Murph for those who
Yeah.
aren't familiar with it?
So well, in CrossFit, there are a lot of named workouts, and mostly in honor of soldiers, many of whom are killed in battle. And so Murph is one that is traditionally done on Memorial Day. And it's a 1 mile run and then 100 pull ups, 200 push ups, 300 air squats, another 1 mile run, all with a 20-pound weighted vest.
Wow. Yes.
Yeah.
So you're a CrossFitter still.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You haven't. I did probably 6 years, but everything started to like break and stuff. So it was just too punishing. How long have you been doing it for?
Well, one thing that's different, I don't do it every day. So
Okay,
I do it like interspersed with other cross training. So right now I do about 6 CrossFit workouts a month. So,
6 months. Okay.
yeah. And that works with my travel schedule. So I think that's a difference. And I feel like, I'm 45, like I've gotten good and listening to my body and not
Hmm.
trying to prove anything to anyone other than
Yes.
myself in the gym.
Yes.
So,
Very important part of CrossFit is not proving it. So the crazy thing about this, I've done I've actually never done this workout with the weighted
yeah.
vest. I'm a former gymnast, so Murph is, and I'm a very light, I'm lean. So Murph is like all body strength. It's like my dream,
Yeah.
my dream
You could do those
workout.
pull-ups.
Yeah, I can do the pull-ups. And then there's a whole thing with there's unbroken where you do it in the
Yeah.
order that you just described it. So you have to do 100
Yep.
pull-ups before you can get, and then there's partitioned where people break it up into like,
Yep.
I never did it unbroken. I did it partitioned without a weighted vest. And I think I did in like 49 minutes, which I thought was good. And then, so Mark Zuckerberg did it in, what was it? Did you remember? It was 43?
38 minutes, I
Oh,
think it
38
was.
minutes.
Yeah. Yeah.
38 minutes.
Yeah. I know
He did
that
it
was a
partition.
badass time though. That was,
Yeah,
I mean, that was serious. Mhm.
yeah, I know. And so the funny thing about that, I, you know, I don't have a horse in the Mark Zuckerberg race. I don't particularly like Facebook and what it stands for. I think he's a big dork, but I'm nothing really against. Well, actually, I do. I am against some of the ways that Facebook has like shredded democracies and things like that. But we'll put that.
We'll say that for another episode.
Yeah, we'll save that for another episode. But the interesting thing is that people were very triggered by that. So there's this Instagram photo of him. I'll put it in the show notes. And it's so weird. It's like kind of blurry. And it's like a weird like angle. And he's like, but he is jacked. Like
Yeah.
he's like his forearms are, thick as trunks. And it really like it triggered people. I know you're from the CrossFit community, so you probably didn't see the triggering side of it. But
What were some of the comments? Because I saw his post, but I didn't see
oh
like all
yeah.
the chatter about it.
So there were a few. One was the one that I saw the most of, which I think is complete bullshit, is, well, if I was a billionaire, I'd have enough time to get that rip.
Oh,
And I'm like, seriously? Like, do you know how
no.
being the CEO of the, I don't know, third largest company in the world, do you know how that
How
works? Like,
busy it is. Yeah.
so there was this kind of like, he's got money. Oh, he's got money,
Mhm.
time, and access to the best
Mhm.
trainers. And
Mhm.
so I don't know.
Mhm.
I'm like, all you need to do, Murph, is a pull-up bar. Like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's not like a
Yeah.
trainer's gonna help you get a
Yeah.
better time on that. So that was one. There was
Mm.
another. I guess it was like, it's so insensitive to post a picture of yourself in great shape when you're laying off a lot of employees.
Mhm.
So I don't know. I mean,
Mhm.
I've posted pictures of myself working out, and I had to lay off. It was not at the scale of. I don't think I'm a bad person for doing an occasional workout
Mhm.
picture. So that was the other one. Then there was a lot of like, he's on testosterone.
Oh.
So like, excuse me, but he's like, he's younger than us. He's like probably barely 40.
Yeah, a lot of guys are on testosterone, right? That's
Yeah.
very common, but that doesn't mean that like
You
I
could do a
mean,
38-minute Murph just from
yeah, like
taking testosterone.
no, exactly. Like that's not going to be enough. So it's
Yeah.
interesting because all of this chatter, valid points, but underneath them are like some pretty big, like philosophical questions. Like the
Mm,
second one about, well, you're working out and showing this and you're laying off people really opens up an interesting question about like the CEO's personal responsibility
mm,
for a business's, booms and busts, right? Like
mhm.
as an entrepreneur, as a CEO,
Yeah.
it's really something to look at is like, well, how much of it was preventable or not?
Mm,
And what would it have really taken to prevent it? And how much of it is
mm,
just the natural, again, ebbs and flows of a capitalist economy. And there are just going to be times when businesses have to downsize. And I think this is a philosophical question that is in is
Mm.
live right now in our
Yeah.
society about what is a business's obligation to its employees
Mhm.
versus to its own survival and itself. Like, and then the
Ooh.
CEO as the figurehead of that, like, that's a big
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Oh. Well, I think
Mhm.
we might touch on that in our main event question. But I do, yeah, and there's something about, and then it's true because obviously, like someone really fit, and it can trigger whenever insecurity you have about the way you look, and then you
Sure.
see someone, especially someone like him, who like everyone thinks of him as Jesse Eisenberg in the social, like the
Mhm.
scrawny hooded sweatshirt nerd. But yeah, it is this like this much deeper, it exposes kind of like what's the real question. Well, actually, so that would
Yeah.
be a good segue because I think we'll
Yeah.
probably cover that. So we're gonna jump into the main segment. Before I jump in, so as everyone knows, we're gonna have these questions. Every episode will be a question. And we have in our community, we have these group coaching cohorts. So we actually are doing this with groups of 3 to 10 people. So if you're interested in learning more about it, go to radreads.co/coaching, and you can see when the future cohort starts. So today's question, we'll come back to Mark in this. Why are we so obsessed with growth? And it's scripted in a way to be quite open ended. I thought I might kick us off with two flavors of a quote that I often hear. So one, I got, kind of obsessed or passionate about the question of like, what is happiness or what is contentment?
Mm.
And one question that people often answer for happiness is progress. So
Mhm.
it's an interesting frame, right? Happiness is progress. And there's probably a more poignant or another version of saying it is, I've heard people say, if you're not growing, you're shrinking. And again, you can think of this as like, in the old days, you know, people thought that lifestyle businesses, like before the life
Mhm.
part of work-life balance took over, like people used to shit on lifestyle businesses.
Mhm.
They're like, oh,
Mhm.
that means you
Oh, yeah.
can't get venture money. That
Yep.
means you can't play that. You're not
Yep.
qualified to play that game. You're too lazy. You don't want to put in the hours,
Yep.
and you don't have the upside. Now it's so funny. Even in my adulthood, the pendulum has swung where everyone wanted to be a venture-backed founder,
Yep.
and I'm glad we're talking to a venture-backed founder in kind of like the 2000s, early 2000s, probably leading up to the financial, actually beyond. And now everyone's like the number one flex is who controls their time, who owns their time, who has freedom, who never has to go. And it's just
Yep.
funny to see that. So when you,
But there's
yeah,
an interesting, like,
yeah,
even inside of that,
hmm
do you think that a lot of people prefer a lifestyle business because they want to pursue personal growth, right? They don't want
mm,
their professional growth to constrain their
yeah,
personal growth. So they want to go traveling and become a yoga instructor and study Buddhism
yeah,
and learn to
yeah.
cook, right?
Yeah, no, that's it's fascinating. There's this one I'm gonna draw a blank on his name, but there's this one entrepreneur, and he's had a few exits. It's like the extreme version of what you described. You probably know who I'm talking about. And he's turned into one of those. I call them the longevity nut jobs. They're so scared of dying.
Oh, I know. Brian, you're talking
Yes,
about Brian.
Johnson.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
He did a payments company.
Okay. I don't
Yeah.
know him. I don't read his stuff, but he says he's obsessed with this slowing down your biological age. And
Yeah.
so I guess you could take some tests and you could be like, well, your body thinks it's 43, but your calendar age is 49.
It's your telomeres.
Okay.
So they'll measure the length of your telomeres, and longer telomeres reflect that you're younger.
Okay.
Like your biological age is younger. So
Okay.
yeah.
What's a telomere? I know nothing about
It's a part of the cell, right?
Okay.
I'm not sure. I want to say it might be in the mitochondria, but I'm not sure. But it's part of the cell. And yeah, this is like the most reliable indicator of your actual biological age is the
Got
length of
it.
your telomere. Mhm.
Got it. And so he
Mhm.
has this, he spends like 2 to 3 hours, because I'm saying this in relation to the work-life balance.
Yeah.
He spends 2 to 3 hours a day, like plunging and what diet and like,
There's a
it's like a
video you
full-time
can
job.
watch. Yeah,
Okay, we're
so
going to find,
I'm on his list. I'll send it to you. We can post it
yeah,
and
we'll post it.
everyone can watch his video. But you are 100% right that in this video, he goes through a day in his life. So it starts with, for example, he sleeps separate from his partner because he calculated that by when they sleep together, he doesn't sleep as well.
Okay.
So they sleep in separate rooms. He sleeps in a temperature controlled, light controlled, everything controlled environment. He measures like everything he drinks, everything he eats, the vitamin composition. He had like every single aspect of every day is calculated and premeditated and optimized. He only eats food that's optimized for like his like DNA profile. It's that level of detail. It's
Oh
so
my
wild.
God.
Yeah.
Oh,
Talk about obsessed with growth. I mean, it's not growth classically, but it's obsessed with like
personal.
cracking this or like
Yeah.
figuring this out. It's obsession with defying aging, which is
Yeah.
similar to like being
Hmm.
obsessed with growth. It's like somehow a
Ooh.
winning or a beating or a getting somewhere kind of thing.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I find that men tend to be, I know a lot of
Mhm.
driven professional women, but I don't think any of I mean, they obviously don't want to die prematurely, but I don't think I've ever met a woman in the like live forever crowd. And I
Uh-huh.
go to these conferences, you go to the gym at, and it's all, and I inject this. I see they're trading
Well,
doctors like they're
so
baseball
this is
cards.
so
This is a very
timely for
Austin
me.
thing too.
Wow, this is so timely because I'm 45, my partner's 50, and he just started losing his hair, but it like
Hmm.
started coming out fast.
Hmm.
And it's thrown him into just like a whole existential
Mm.
tizzy about aging and being old and death, shaken him. And I've had to look at like, gosh, he's so shaken. Like, I don't have the same experience. I was like, oh, well, my body's been falling apart ever since I had kids, right? Like,
Mhm.
and I think
Yeah.
as a woman, even just dealing with your period is like this
Mhm.
terrible physical inconvenience every damn month,
Mhm.
and you're bloated and your boobs are swollen and you got pimples and then you have kids and now everything's drooping and sagging and you're peeing yourself. And it's just
Mm.
like it's just so embarrassing ever since you were 12 that
Mhm.
I think, obviously going through menopause is another big stressor and can be emotionally very burdensome on women. But I think we're like more prepared for this
Mhm.
whole aging and falling
Yeah,
apart
yeah.
thing than guys are who like perfect until now.
I know,
Like,
I
okay.
know. Oh my God. Oh, I could say so much. So I started to notice. So this your yeah, your partner may want to watch this when we're done. But so I started to notice I was losing my hair in when I was 20. So it was a slow burn. So it's like it looks very good up front, but like I, and it's weird because in some way it's funny that you mentioned that. In some way, it gave me so much empathy for women,
Mhm.
where
Mhm.
it's like I would look, and I've said this, and it's like a weird thing. It's like I have a six pack, but I don't like to look at myself in the mirror because I'm just reminded of my hair loss.
Oh,
So
that's
it's like,
terrible.
so
I'll
it's
trade my
like,
hair for your
yeah,
6 pack.
and it's a crazy thing, and so I had like since 20, and and I can imagine it to the point earlier you said about empathy, with kids, but like there's certain ways that like I know that like when a camera faces a certain way, it's like I know where, and it's like thing that I think men don't normally think about, and definitely not in their 20s. And so for me, it's been this like slow burn from like I'm 44 in a couple months, and this month actually. And so like a few funny things. So I used to like so I used to order Rogaine when I was living with Lisa, my wife, but we were dating at the time. And I would order it from like a different online provider. So it wouldn't like show up in the online, like the cart
Oh,
history,
right.
the order
Mhm.
history. So I'd like buy it from like Walmart.com where, everything else was Amazon. Then I would rip off all the stickers, the labels. I was probably like late
I
20s doing this, and leave them in the medicine cabinet. And we might not even have been living together. And I would rip them off and put them there. And so there'd just be like this random like tin thing. And I never talked about it. And when I turned
yeah.
40, 4 years ago, I like kind of turned to Lisa. I'm like, hey, I've never said this, but like I feel really shitty about this myself. I'm insecure about it. And I told her, I'm like, oh, I've been losing my hair. She's like, oh,
Yeah.
duh. But I had never
Yeah.
once acknowledged it to
Yeah.
anyone, including my
Yeah.
wife. Like I was,
Yeah.
and she's like, so that's why there's like these Rogaine bottles, like the stickers peeled off all these years, you know?
Well,
She knew, but she didn't want to like poke, like
oh no.
poke the bear. So it's been, it's
I
been
get
a,
it.
it's been an intense, like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's not fun. Like there were definitely
No.
times I wouldn't say I was depressed. I don't know I don't think I was clinically depressed, but there were times when I didn't want to like see anyone, and like certain
But
friends would always say something, and I'm like I didn't want to hang out with those people.
I think this is actually totally inside of our question here of why are we so obsessed with
Mm,
growth?
yeah.
And I think part of it is because we are deathly afraid of death, right?
Hmm.
Like it's like if I stop growing, I'm dying, right?
Hmm.
I'm aging, I'm falling apart,
Yeah.
and it's just terrible. And I read a really interesting book recently called Next Level, and
Okay.
it's for women athletes that are going through menopause.
Okay.
And the author's whole goal is to challenge this idea that after menopause, you're basically just like, you know, turning into a aging ball of flab.
Hmm.
And one of the things she cites in the introduction is that it's documented that women who live in cultures where menopause is revered and where aging is
Mm.
revered and accepted experience clinically fewer symptoms of menopause than women who
Wow.
live in cultures where menopause is seen as a negative thing and aging is feared. And
Wow.
that really hit me. Like the more we resist it, the more it
Hmm.
clinically afflicts us.
Yeah.
Right. And so
Wow.
that's the conversation I was trying to have with Steve is like there about his hair, is like
Hmm.
your hair's falling out, your skin is sagging, your eyelids are
Hmm.
drooping, the spots are showing up.
Yeah.
Babe, it's a lost cause. Like,
Mhm.
like what if we just surrendered gracefully and so, it's kind of interesting to think about like
Yeah.
how would our cultural obsession with growth and improvement shift if we could more lovingly embrace our aging and our mortality
Mhm.
and our frailty and our imperfection?
Mhm. Do you think that, or have you ever read any Ram Dass or listened
No.
to? So Ram Dass, spiritual, is actually a fascinating story. I'll give the super quick version, but he was like like chosen one, kid of immigrants, Jewish kid of immigrants in Long Island, was like one of the early tenured professors of psychology at Harvard, like
Mm,
tenure track, all the stuff. And he was like, this is so empty. It's right at the coming of age of LSD and
mm, mm,
psychedelics in the US. Takes a ton of psychedelics and feels this like state of bliss, of
mm.
introspection, but always comes down. And he's like, I believe that you can have that state of existence all the time. And
Yeah.
it's like my mission. And so he basically takes a pilgrimage
Mm,
to India, becomes a guru, and all that
mm,
fascinating story. He's a
mm,
prolific podcast. He would
mm,
basically record every talk on cassette.
mm,
And so there's
mm,
hundreds and hundreds of hours of his,
mm,
Dharma talks.
mm,
But he has a big thing about aging. He has a book called I'm
mm,
Still Here. And he would just talk about the loss of control, this like the human frailty and like
mm, mm,
surrendering to human frailty, and how he had a stroke and he was still
mm,
still like very with it, and he was just glowing. Like there's a Netflix documentary on
mm,
him where he had a stroke. He needs someone to basically like move him around, but he just has this like
mm,
glowing
mm.
presence to him.
Well, and for me, what's showing up in that is truly fully embracing and accepting that just being is enough.
Mm-hmm. Oh.
And, I think we talked about the book 4,000 Weeks
Mm-hmm.
that I read recently. And that's one of the central tenets of this book is that our human lifespan is an average of 4,000 weeks. And
Mm-hmm.
we get so caught up in grind culture and achievement culture and trying to get somewhere. And really, most people are unhappy with that.
Mm-hmm.
And that, just being is enough. And, so his call to the kind of hero's call is to just follow your heart. That what the world needs is people who have come alive through their passions, whatever your passion might be.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that so many of us are afraid to do that because it doesn't feel meaningful, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like let's say my passion is gardening.
Mm-hmm.
Have I led a meaningful life if all I did was garden,
Mm-hmm.
my whole life? And so I think this conversation of like obsession with growth is also entwined with this search for meaning, like
Yeah.
wanting to make our lives meaningful or significant, which is not the same thing. I think
Mm-hmm.
significance has this shadow side, right? Like we are so, terrified of our obliviousness that we
Mm-hmm.
want to prove to ourselves that we mattered and we were significant.
Yeah.
And if I'm growing and striving and achieving, maybe
Mm-hmm.
I'm doing that. But one of my mentors, John Mackey from Whole Foods, he always used the analogy of like, it's like a bucket with a hole in it, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're never,
Yeah.
if you are trying to prove to yourself your own significance, the hole's in your bucket. Like you're not going to be
Mm-hmm.
able to do it.
Yeah, it's funny. I was just texting with some friends this morning, and we're all kind of in that age where we've had a decent amount of career success, life's fine, everything kind of basic needs plus is covered. And but we're losing hair, we're losing loved ones, and so my friend said something like this. I think he's a hedge fund manager. It's very common to see in people like, oh, we talk about how there's a fundamental belief that we're not good. And that's the hole in the bucket, or that's a hole in the bucket. And he said, I think it's very common and harder to see in people like us, like type A people who have no obvious self-esteem issues and in general think highly of ourselves. But often that self-worth is dependent on accomplishments, being a good dad, being in shape, having money to spend, not being lazy. If stripped all away, would we still feel good? And the answer for me is probably not. And that means that we only conditionally love ourselves. And he writes, not very nice, exclamation point.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so what do
Yeah.
you, so this question of like the hole in the bucket. And so is what John's saying that all the striving is to kind of try a futile attempt to plug the hole
Mhm. Or to fill the bucket,
or to fill the bucket. Got it.
to have the bucket feel full, but it never
Hmm.
will because there's a
Yeah.
hole in it. And you're just going to have to put more in it. Like, oh, you made your first million. Now you got to make 5 million. Now you got to make 10
Hmm.
million. Now you need to make 1 billion. Now you got to buy a yacht. Now you got to buy a helicopter.
Yeah.
Let's like, or whatever. Like, oh, I lost. Wow, I really finally lost those 5 pounds. Oh, now I need to lose 10 pounds. Now I want a six
Hmm.
pack. Now I want to run a marathon. Now I want to do an Ironman. Like, there's
Yeah.
always something else,
I know. I
Like,
know. How has that manifested in your life? You're, a very driven person. You've accomplished a lot. Have you had that like conditional self acceptance ever? Or do you have it?
Well, have I had the self acceptance? I think I'm more toward that I've ever been,
Mhm.
but I recognize that some of that is also because I did achieve some of the things I
Mhm.
wanted to achieve. Right? I just sold my company, and
Yeah.
that felt like a really big milestone. And in fact, I had a dream just a couple of weeks ago that I was walked into a place and it was like a bar, but it was only for entrepreneurs. And so everyone's sitting around laughing and drinking. And I walked in the dream. I was like, oh, well, I'm good because I've sold my company. It was in my thought. Like I felt
Wow.
already that sense of like, I don't have to prove anything to anyone because I already sold my company. And I was like,
Mhm.
wow, that's deep in my subconscious,
Wow. Wow.
like, so, yeah, but I think it's something to strive for. I still struggle with like productivity. I find myself wanting to make days productive and
Mhm.
spend my time wisely. And I think that's all still inside of like trying to get somewhere. Like, what if I
Mm.
just had a meandering day that I didn't
Yeah.
plan? I rarely do that.
Mhm. Well, so how does this so one thing that I shared the Jenny Odell book with you, Saving Time. I know if
Oh, I didn't read it.
you
Yeah, I'm
haven't
not
read it,
sure.
but it's a fascinating book. I'm about halfway through it, but there's one chapter on basically like productivity. It basically shits on productivity bros and productivity culture. And fun fact is, our friendship actually started
Yeah.
through productivity. You remember how we met?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that webinar that you
Yeah,
did.
GTD webinar. And I will say you were. I take this because I knew you were a productivity person, and you paid me a very nice compliment, which is like you always follow up.
Yeah.
And I'm like, it's that to me productivity, and that's where productivity works well because it's like
Yeah.
productivity makes me follow up and show up, but then there's the dark side. But so she makes this point that, and you're a policy buff and politics person. I'm not political science, but she makes this point that like a lot of this. So we talked a lot about the spiritual side, but she ties it to the capitalist side or the economic
Mhm.
systems side, and she draws this link between kind of neoliberalism, neoliberal economies,
Yeah.
and basically imposing this story upon us. So I think
Yeah.
people, and her book is definitely more geared towards like showing the power imbalance of it. And like
Mhm.
when I have the conversation, and I'm not speaking for you, but when I have it, it's a little bit more of a spiritual side. It's like, why is my cup
Mhm.
empty? And it's
Mhm.
less about like, have we structurally set up a system? Is this the byproduct of a system that's been
Yeah.
set up in a fucked up
Yeah.
way, or so on? So I guess, and you could see it, you being an entrepreneur, a
Yeah.
venture back, but maybe said differently is like, what is the relationship between
Yeah.
capitalism and this
Yeah.
need
Yeah.
to always be improving and
Oh
growing?
yeah. This is probably the one of the I was going to say it's the number one question that I contemplate, let's say in
Hmm.
the realm of my professional
Yeah.
domain. For sure. I do think that the economic system that we're living in currently perpetuates this cycle of the mindset of scarcity,
Yeah.
the feeling of having to compete to win, right? And yeah.
Individualism.
Mhm. And that if you're not actively fighting for a piece, you're going to get left behind,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think that is all part of this. I don't think it was masterminded or like it's somebody's like the wizard's
Mm-hmm.
dark plan, but I do think it's a consequence of the regulatory environment that we've architected our economy with, and it's not working. Like
Yeah.
I think this thing is it's going to implode or explode or something. Maybe not in our lifetime, but this doesn't work. Mhm.
And what do you think is the weakest link in it all? Well, like,
And it has no real considerations for equality or
mm-hmm.
even I'm not saying like equality, like everybody has to be equal. Like we mentioned earlier, I went to Russia in 1991 and I studied Russian and communism for 10 years. So I know
Mm-hmm.
that system very well, and that does not work.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not advocating for that. But the incredible inequality that capitalism is enabling, that is not sustainable for human beings or for the planet, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and,
Yeah.
and there's no system right now. So I'll tell you a little story about selling my company. Unfortunately, in the sale of my company, the common stock wasn't worth anything. And so there was a debate because all the employees hold common stock and options. And so there was a debate of whether the employee should get anything. And for me, it was very clear that after 10 years of running this company, even though we hadn't had the, the exit that we had all hoped for, the employees were still a critical piece, and that it's called a carve out. They would actually carve a piece of the sale price off and make that available to retain and incentivize employees. And many of my investors were vehemently opposed to this. Employees got their salaries, they got their compensation, until investors, get their money, employees shouldn't get anything. And to me, it was like such a startling reveal about how capital and labor, like in this particular example, were not allies, right? And capital providers, not all of them, but there was a group who were like, no, the labor shouldn't get anything. They got their piece. We're getting ours. And, we were talking about a difference for those investors of about $5,000.
Wow.
That they were saying
cumulative total.
Each. For each
investor.
person's impact of the carve out.
Got it.
Was probably going to be like $5,000.
Wow.
But so it was a philosophical, no. And that's the kind of stuff where I thought to myself, okay, if I ever start another company, it's going to be in the early founding documents that if there's a sale at a price below a certain threshold, blah, 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 there will be a carve out and it will be this amount. And so that investors know upfront what my position is on the participation of labor and capital. But to me, those are some of the behind the scene things in capitalism that perpetuate. I mean, goodness, the rich are getting richer, the labor's not getting anything, and employees are left feeling like they have to scramble and cling, and then we're back to the Mark Zuckerberg of why people feel so embittered that he has time to work out, because they're feeling like they're being flicked out like a pawn, a disposable, pawn, which is really how capitalism as we are enacting it, how it views labor. So
oh man. And I think and then the other argument of it is if you were to put yourself in Mark Zuckerberg's shoes, and he's like, I've followed let's put the privacy laws aside. I've followed every economic law, to date. Everyone here is at will. I didn't coerce anyone. Everyone knew what they signed up for. Everyone got a contract.
But this, to me, this is where I said, what's driving the outcomes is the regulatory environment that enables capitalism. So that's really what this comes down to. Because he is following every law. The day traders are following every law. The analysts are following every law. And their behaviors are causing so many, negative consequences for the daily lives of human beings. And so these become ethical or societal questions about how much, for example, wealth inequality are we willing to sustain as a society? I agree, founders create disproportionate value to an office manager that in terms of the current capitalistic model. But I don't believe that it's a trillion times more value. So what should that gap be? And there are B Corps and some other groups have started to take a stab at defining, parameters around some of this that are more equitable. But I think this is a big part of, that feeling of you can never get there. Right.
And I think that, you take the person that's one statistic that always shocked me is that 95% of U.S. stocks are held by 5% of U.S. households, which in my mind, it almost tells you, it's not even a red-blue thing. It just tells you everything you need to know. And about Fed policy and look, I've been on the good end of that trade, but you're like, like
Yeah.
it's like all this stuff about, you know, the 401k policies and all of that. Like when you look at where the money actually is concentrated, and I'm not
Mm,
saying it's bad to have a 401k, but if you look at the way policy is being constructed, it is like
yeah.
the people who own the companies, it's not usually at the at the for the benefit of the individual. And so it's like it's always blown my mind to see these inequalities. Someone was telling me this is in London, but the inequality has gotten so bad that the really, like, now you're talking like like oligarchs and billionaires, but they now walk around Chelsea, which is the fanciest neighborhood in
Mm,
London, with private security.
mhm.
So the way capitalism like fixes this
Yeah.
is like you just like
Privatization.
you
Mm,
erect more walls so that the 5% or whatever 1%, however you want to call it, is just more,
yeah.
protected, or quote unquote protected in their bubble, and the rest it's kind of just like, go, like favela, like
Yeah.
go fend for
Yeah.
yourself. I'm good. I got my private security, my
Yeah.
private chef, my private driver, my this and this and
Yeah.
this.
Yeah. And we've
As
seen plenty of apocalyptic movies that depict what that looks like.
Mhm.
Hunger Games, here we
Yeah,
go. Mm,
yeah. So but to go back to so in that, if or when you start your next company, and you're to document that, like, how do you deal with the fact that that will instantly make you less attractive? That clause that you would put in would make you less attractive to investors, which, knowing you would have another mission-driven company. So you're in this like weird, it's like, do I take the quote unquote dirty money so that I can advance my social enterprise, or do I just cover my nose and just be like, I'll cross that bridge later? It's when the system is so entrenched, like it
yeah.
takes there's so many stakeholders that, like, one person, it's like recycling, right? Or like,
I think it's an interesting question, whether that's true. So
hmm.
right now I was handed a copy. I'm reading a New Earth by
Oh,
Eckhart
Eckhart
Tolle.
Tolle. I love
Yeah.
Eckhart Tolle. I haven't read that
And
one.
yeah, and he's got this idea that it's not linear. Change comes, it's like slow, 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 and then boom.
Hmm.
No one saw it coming,
Yeah.
right? And so that has had me thinking, because I really want to agitate around the economy. Like, this
Hmm.
does not work. It's not sustainable, and so, but I started to talk myself out of it. Like, oh, how am I going to change anything? And there's so much to fix, and it's so
Hmm.
entrenched, and da 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 da, all the
I'm
things you just
very guilty
said.
of that.
Mhm. And then I'm like, well, but what if it is the moment? What if it's the moment in a minute and I'm the first
Hmm.
second in the minute, And like, so I am at the place right now of like, I wouldn't take the dirty money and
Hmm.
just try to win. That's actually Brian Johnson, who we talked about. He started
Hmm.
this company, Braintree. And I met with him once, and he told me the only reason he started and grew that company was because he wanted to get rich and do other interesting things with his money.
Hmm.
So it was all a means to an end.
Yeah.
And I'm not willing to do that. To
Yeah.
me, the journey is as much about the statement as the what I
Hmm.
can do with the wealth on the other side.
Yeah.
Now, I've learned some really hard lessons. Like, I would run my business differently next time. I would spend differently. I would value bootstrapping. Not that I would totally bootstrap, but I would have more of a frugal mindset than I did the first time around, when I got in such a snowball where I had to fundraise, I had to fundraise, I had
Hmm.
to fundraise. So there
Another
are
byproduct
strategies.
of the
Yeah,
system, right?
exactly. And exactly. So I think it would have to be a different kind of, maybe more like guerrilla entrepreneurship,
Hmm.
where you're really, there's an end goal, but you can't just surrender to the system to try to get there, because it
Yeah.
will take you. It will
Hmm.
take you.
So would
Mhm.
you give that same advice to, a 21-year-old entrepreneur? Because you have that, like,
It depends what they're up
experience and
to.
accolades. Yeah.
I mean, if you're a social entrepreneur and you want to really do things differently between labor and capital and have a different culture and different kinds of relationships with your employees, you cannot take venture capital, classic
Mm.
venture capital.
Yeah.
You just can't.
Yeah.
It is not trying to do the same thing you're trying to do, you know.
Hmm.
So, but you know, if you're a 21-year-old and you've got a great AI SaaS platform, and you know that's all you
Yeah.
want to do is spread that and make a lot of money, then that's a
Hmm.
different path.
Yeah. You know what the interesting thing to tie it together, because you know how we started as a more spiritual existential question, losing your hair, fear of death, empty bucket. But here's the people always ask me why I left, you know, why I left Wall Street.
Mhm.
And there's a slew of reasons. But the one that I usually say, like the TLDR, is that it was a very kind of scarcity based thinking. Like
Mhm.
the whole system was based on
Yeah,
scarcity. And
yeah,
so scarcity brings up backstabbing and stealing from your, you know, like doing borderline unethical things with clients and countless other behaviors. But I always add, and you're actually putting it together. I mean, there was one other piece to it, is that it was all run by insecure men. And so you take that, like a
oh
flawed system, and then you take these buckets that you were
yeah,
discussing
oh,
that need,
a bucket with a hole in it.
yeah, you take
Yeah,
these buckets with holes in them, and they're meant, they're humans, but in
yeah.
the case of Wall Street, and I could see it, again, like in a situation where a venture capitalist is fighting for
Hmm.
$5,000, um, you're this is really a bucket. This is a bucket question. This isn't even an economics question at that
Yep,
point,
exactly,
right?
exactly. That
And
was
that's
exactly the point.
and that's that's fucked up. I'm a bit of a cynic in that I've seen it in so many different flavors of
Yeah,
it, but I'm also
I
a
think,
deep optimist that, you know,
and that I think that's why Eckhart Tolle and others believe that the only real salvation is the shift in
yeah,
consciousness. You know, that people have to wake up and
yeah,
realize that that's all the matrix.
yeah,
It's not real. Like
yeah,
you've been programmed to chase all this stuff and it's not real. It's not actually what makes you come alive as a human being.
hmm,
And I'm optimistic, like coming back to our kids, which is where we started. Like
yeah,
I feel like they're so much more in tune with
hmm,
love and connection. My daughter tells her friends, I love you. And I'm always struck by that. I never told any of my friends I love you, you
yeah. I
know?
just
And
started
she,
saying it.
yeah, like at the end of her call, she's like, okay, good night. I love you. Or I love you. And I'm like,
Yeah.
wow, that's so cool.
Mhm.
So I am hopeful that that flower of human consciousness is opening, but there's, you know, a lot of old, wealthy, powerful people that
Mhm.
are gonna have to die off for stuff.
Yeah. And this, and kind of swimming upstream against the prevailing system, right? I think.
Yeah,
Wow. Beautiful.
yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
We're gonna have to get you back for a round. There's so many other questions. This has been, I mean, we've talked for almost 90 minutes. So
Well,
this has been,
that's why I think why we said we would do this because we
this,
always have great conversations.
I know. And I'm so glad there's so many questions. I've been like building up a list of questions that I've wanted to ask you. And it is, you are really, you truly unique in that you can like, you can bridge those two worlds. I think there's people that like stay in the kind of spiritual consciousness world. And then there's people that just stay in the business world,
Oh,
and they tend to just like look at each other with
mm,
disdain and
mm,
scorn. And I think it will take, I think it'll take an appreciation of both worlds for real change to happen. Because
yeah,
so thank you for being
yeah. Yeah.
a part of that.
Yeah,
Oh,
well, I recently articulated that as I was thinking about what's the next chapter for me, and I was like, I want to be a spiritual leader
mhm.
and I want to be a CEO. And I think
Yes.
the domain of my spiritual practice or
Hmm.
spiritual leadership is in business. So someone else may do it in a nonprofit or in a place of worship. And for
Yes.
me, I want to bring that into business. So,
And
mhm.
and for better or for worse, in the West, that's how you get things done. It's like, is it moves through business. Business touches everything. So,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
oh, awesome. Well, before we go, I always ask two questions. One is there any creator, writer, thinker, up and coming that you want to highlight that we should all go read and pay attention to?
Yeah, well, actually, when you said creator, I took it as like more artists,
Yeah,
which was a fun challenge to think
yeah.
about who in my world is making. And there's
Hmm.
two people that I wanted to shout
Yeah.
out. One is Lily Sparks.
Okay.
She's the
We'll link
founder and
to.
CEO of a company called Afterglow,
Okay.
and they are an ethical porn site for women.
Oh, I've
So
heard
they're
about ethical
making,
porn as a
yeah, and so their website is XO Afterglow,
so
and
after. Okay, we'll
yeah,
link
it's
to
just
that.
cool. It's really cool content. They're really exploring like what is sexy, but what is sexy for women and
Hmm.
couples, and it's not easy. They've been
Yeah.
having kind of a hard time cracking it. So check that out. And
Plus,
then
to
yeah,
plus all the labor questions that come in with pornography, right? I'm
yep.
we're talking about, VCs getting shafting people for 5 grand. It's probably on a whole different level in that industry.
It's totally there's a whole industry disruption.
Yeah.
There's so many layers to this
Yeah.
company that she's up to.
So cool.
So it's cool. But I think even just from a creative perspective, looking at the content itself and
Yeah.
how to have it be like celebratory of different body types and gender identities and ethnicities and like there's like so many dimensions and to make it sexy and appealing and like
Yeah.
all of
Oh,
that. So
wow. So
yeah, they're up to
cool.
some cool stuff. And then another pair of entrepreneurs based that they headquarter between Austin and Kenya. It's Zane and Amal, Amal Wildman, and they have a social enterprise called Ubuntu. It's
Oh,
ubuntu.life. And they're making the first ever global fashion brand that's based in Kenya.
wow.
And so they make jewelry like bracelets, but they have bags and shoes and all kinds of amazing products that come out of Kenya, but are getting reach, in the United States and Europe. So it's really cool what they're up to.
Wow.
The backstory is that Zane went to this small village called Maimahu in Kenya and learned about all these severely disabled children who had been exiled from the community and labeled cursed and unwanted and some of them chained up during the day. And so he set on a mission to make a daycare for these kids, and then through that work met their mothers, and the mother said, what we just really need is a job. And
Yeah.
so Zane ended up building a factory for the mothers and had them in the very beginning just sewing things like coffee sleeves and wine carriers. And then over the last, I think it's been 20 years now, he's been building this social enterprise. And now they have a whole hospital and a school and, has
That's
become an international model for the kind of for profit, nonprofit joint venture. And they have an
wow.
incredible fashion brand. So, yeah,
Love
they're
it.
amazing too.
Oh, we will. I can't wait to check them out, and we'll definitely highlight
Mhm.
both of them or both companies on our different channels. And what about you? Where
Mhm.
can people go find learn more about you?
Oh, that's a good, I guess LinkedIn
LinkedIn, right?
is
You're
my,
you're pretty you're
my
pretty
home right
prolific
now.
on
Yeah.
LinkedIn.
So thought leadership is something that I definitely need to do more of, and I can take a page from you.
Yes, we're gonna
So,
talk
but
more
yeah.
about this. Maybe that'll be our next episode.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Susie. This has been absolute joy. I can't wait to share it with our community.
Same. Thank you for having me.